Well, hello everybody and Happy New Year. So we're kicking off a new season and episode of The Reasonably Good Life. I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brooks, and I'm here with my co-host, intern, partner in crime, University of Texas at Austin, undergraduate psychology major, Patrick Kennedy, who's been helping me with The Reasonably Good Life.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Patrick Kennedy. Just like Dr. Brooks just said, I am a psych student at UT Austin, finishing up my third year right now. And so I'm, pursuing a career in counseling. And, a while ago, our relationship kind of formed when I was seeking some sort of a mentor in psychology. And so I found Dr. Brooks, and we've been having some really good conversations ever since. We thought at some point, like, hey, let's start recording this. This is good stuff.
Yeah. So, we were wasting all our good conversations, Patrick. We didn't have any listeners, just you and me. And we know in the age of the internet, if it's not put out there for everyone, it's like it didn't happen. So basically, we haven't had any conversations yet. So, but now we have listeners, and yeah, hopefully this will be a good thing and a learning experience. And part of The Reasonably Good Life, it's all about, growth and improvement and making progress in life. And I think we have to put ourselves out there and try and know that good things can happen when we do. And we only need to aim for reasonably good. So here's the rub. And Patrick and I have had a lot of conversations around this, folks, is I'm a big believer in a reasonably good life. And by that meaning, there's a lot of perfectionism and trying to knock it out of the ballpark. And that ends up causing a lot of stress and a lot of suffering. And that's what today's podcast episode is about, is the purpose and problem of suffering. So perfectionism gets in the way of that. Stress of like always having to get A's in your classes, or, to excel in whatever it is and get into the right undergraduate university, and then the right grad school and the right program, and then in your internship, it just goes on. And we're all trying to hit it out of the park. That causes a lot of stress and suffering. And I view a lot of it unnecessary. And so I think and it actually can get in the way of making progress. And I'm a recovering perfectionist myself, where sometimes I wouldn't even try stuff because I was afraid of failure, right? Afraid I wouldn't do good, do well in it. And so procrastinate. And so then when you only get a B+ on that paper, it's like, well, I just did it all last night, and so you have an out. But aiming for reasonably good, I think is going to take some of the pressure off and actually help us live more fulfilling lives when we don't get in our own way by having all this stress, right? So, and this is the part we've talked about, Patrick, and it's ironic because if we aim to do a reasonably good podcast, there's so much freaking competition out there that you just can't, get any visibility or any listeners. And even if you do a good one, if a person does whatever it is in the age of if they're a YouTuber or whatever, a streamer, TikTok, you name it, even if they do something really well, it's hard to get visibility and attention because everyone's competing, and it's just like a feeding frenzy out there. So aiming for a reasonably good podcast may mean nobody listens. And so that's one of those, but
right. That's one of the unfortunate truths of podcasting, and just, trying to post something to the internet in general, is that it could gain all the traction in the world and be this huge, amazing thing that thousands upon thousands of people listen to, or, it could just be that, we're speaking to maybe a room full of people, 20 people. But I think that the big appeal of the reasonably good life comes in where no matter if it's 100,000 people or a group of just 20 really, devoted listeners, then it doesn't really matter. The point is that it's the expectation that you set for yourself, that it's reasonably good, that it's realistic, that it keeps all of our crazy expectations in check, so that we can have a realistic view about things. And when we experience any degree of failure or success, we're ready for it.
Yeah. And if you can use some of this, listeners or listener, if there's only one of you out there, you listener,
We got a couple.
you lucky the few, the proud. If you can use it, great. And if it helps you improve your life, great. If you find something else that does it better, go for that. I'm a fan of whatever works, and we're going to try to help this work for you. And it's a challenge with this problem of getting visibility or listeners in this when there's so much content out there. But we're going to do, I was going to say our best, but maybe that's not true. We're going to put in a reasonably good effort to make this a reasonably good podcast, because, there's so many hours in the day. But, if we take it back to this idea of suffering, and that's what today's topic is the purpose and problem of suffering. And there's been a lot of it lately in this world, with COVID. We're 2 years now into the pandemic, and as you're listening, the Omicron variant is going crazy all over the world, but especially in America. People are getting sick left and right, and hospitalizations have gone up sky high, and the number of deaths. And so we're suffering a lot, and we're suffering not only those sorts of things, but just the lockdowns and the masks and not being able to go out to concerts, to bars. And, now we're walking this tightrope of, well, do we go out or not? Do we just go ahead and live our lives, or don't we? And then all these arguments that are happening. I mean, what are you seeing at the University of Texas at Austin campus, Patrick? Well, I guess, are you on camp, or is it online right now?
So I'm all online this semester. However, last semester, when I thought things were easing up, I was in person the entire semester. And to be honest, I think the university is doing a great job, at least from like an administration perspective, of saying like, here's what's acceptable, here's what's not. We encourage you to do tests regularly. But I think a lot of people kind of just want to start, living their college student lives again, and going out and like not really acting like there's been any changes, there's been any pandemic. But that varies from person to person. I think within groups, it might be less tolerated than in other groups. So right. I think there's a big range of reactions to it.
Yeah. And I think that's it. I find really frustrating going on in America and elsewhere is all these wars and division over, I don't know, freedom and mask wearing. And, this is really complicated. Mm-hmm. And anyone who says that they have the right answer to this, it's like, no, you don't. No one can have the right answer for how to deal with this, because it's a moving target. It's constantly evolving and changing. And that's, as I had some of the episodes on this, is flexibility. We've got to be flexible in this environment to deal with this. Now, in this, if we can all agree that we've had some extra suffering lately, because of the pandemic. We've had, the stuff with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter. We've had some significant weather events. There's been mass shootings, floods. Last year at this time, we had a blizzard in Texas, which is unheard of. And so and then you have all this stuff playing out about critical race theory and LGBTQ rights and, the wokeism. There's kind of this of hey, we got to be more accepting, and then being intolerant of those people who we deem as they aren't accepting enough. And it's ironically enough. And I think there's a lot of tension, the polarization in the United States that, we're more divisive than we've been in, perhaps sometime after the Civil War. And we've done some episodes on this already. And I think one thing we have to do with our suffering is allow space for the suffering that's going on right now and put it in context. And that's really hard to do. And I had the episode of why does it always feel like it's the end of the world as we know it, even when it's not, or something like that. And borrowing from the REM song. When we look at all the negative news, it really feels overwhelming, like we're going to hell in a handbasket. But if we step back and take more of a historical view of what's going on, even our current pandemic pales in comparison to the pandemics of history, where, was it in the 13th or 14th century, the Black Death and bubonic plague killed like a third to a half of Europe. And that basically, I looked this up, it had an infected fatality rate of near 100%. So when you caught it, you're basically dead.
Game over.
Yeah. And smallpox had a 30% infected fatality rate compared to, I don't know what the latest estimate is for COVID, but it's something like 0.3 or 0.4%, which is, which is worse than the flu for sure. But compared to the pandemics of history, it's not near as bad. Even the Spanish flu pandemic of a century ago, that killed 50 million people worldwide. And it was like 675,000 Americans, but that it had a lower population. 100 years ago, the world had a lower population. So if we convert that today's numbers, the Spanish flu would be like 200 million people. And COVID's killed 5.5, I think is what I saw last, something like that. But yes, COVID's bad. Yes, there's been a lot of suffering. And historically, it's been a lot worse. So what we want to do with our suffering is allow space for it, feel it, and try to put it in context of, well, it could be worse,
without
there's
invalidating it, of course, right?
Yes.
This doesn't matter. It does matter, and it is important, but it can be helpful and it can be healthy to think about it relative to the past.
Right, exactly. So it's not an either or it's a both and. And I think that's where sometimes I feel like I'll get in trouble, or people, oh, you're saying that things aren't bad now? What? No. There's real suffering. And I shudder to think of what life was like 100 years ago during the Spanish flu, and then we have online learning, we have Netflix, we can watch Tiger King and Ted Lasso and all these things. We've got video games, we can talk to our friends with our smartphones and social media, so there's real suffering. It sucks to not be able to go out to the bars and have concerts just like we used to. And I wouldn't want to trade places with someone from 100 years ago, or God forbid, 600 years ago during the Black Death and medieval Europe. That would
me neither.
Life would suck really bad then. And it's hard to realize that because we only know what we experience, right? We only know our own pain. It's kind of like if your worst injury or illness you've ever had was the flu, then you wouldn't know what some other illness that like chemotherapy or going through that. If you've only had the flu, it's like, well, if you've ever known someone to go through chemotherapy or have something worse happen, their pain level is objectively, they've suffered a lot more. But we only know our own pain at the same time. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So pain and suffering is relative.
Yes. Yeah. And so that there's that quote that pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And I looked it up, because we have this wonderful internet where we can Google stuff and we find out like, hey, who actually said this? And oftentimes we find out that it wasn't who we thought it was.
We don't know.
Yeah. There was some funny meme about it was something like, one thing we know about the internet is not everything you read is true on it. And then it was like Abraham Lincoln, or something. So, it's like, yes, you can't believe everything. Now, I looked up, I could not figure out who originally said that. And I used Quote Investigator, and they couldn't really identify exactly who said it. But let's just take that away for right now. Somebody smart and wise, put that together. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And let's unpack that a little bit, because they make a distinction between pain and suffering. And I think that's where you can get into hair splitting of like, well, what exactly do you mean? But let's just say there's a certain part of life there's going to be suffering, right? It's part of the human condition. You've suffered, I've suffered, and we listeners out there, or listener, we won't go into great detail about our suffering, but you've suffered, listeners, and you can think of some of those times, and yes, they suck. And so there's truth that there is nobody anywhere who has not suffered. No king, no ruler, politician, celebrities. I mean, God, I would hate to trade places with some celebrities. Their lives look like train wrecks, like
hyper surveillance culture that just constantly being followed, and like every step that you take is being documented. I wouldn't wish that upon anybody, actually.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. It's like the old saying of be careful what you wish for. And so if we all, listeners, everybody agree that part of life we're going to suffer, and that can be little ways of, a paper cut, or we have, we get an offender bender, or we get injured in some way, skiing or tripping down the stairs. COVID, people get sick, they really suffer. The flu, we suffer loss of jobs, romantic breakups and things with our partners can be painful, being harassed, bullied, those sorts of things, losing a good job, or we don't get hired at this job that we really wanted to get. And all those things is that we suffer for them. And there's never been anyone anywhere who hasn't experienced some type of suffering. It's also true that some people suffer a lot more than others, so like you had COVID, correct?
I did. I had COVID a couple weeks ago. It was pretty rough. And I thought I was doing everything to prevent it. I mean, among, my friends and family, like I'm usually the one saying, hey, like, let's put on a mask before we go inside, or like washing my hands after I touch things that I know lots of other people have touched. And I thought I was really careful about it, but a friend of mine got it, and I spent a day with him before he tested positive. And so then I got it. And I mean, just like that, it happens. You barely have to go, outside anymore to get it. It's just kind of.
It's all over the place. And I assume you've had the flu at some point in your life.
Actually, I haven't had the flu. I remember I was really sick when I was a lot younger. And it was like, I don't know what it was.
So you can't compare it to the You can't compare COVID to the flu then for our listeners, since you haven't had a recent bout of the flu.
I remember it a little bit. I remember I was in bed all day with the fever, and it got so bad that it caused me to have temporary asthma for a couple of years afterward. I don't know what it was though, but it was pretty rough. It was a lot rougher than I expected, especially with people saying that Omicron isn't as bad in terms of symptoms.
I've known in listeners, if you haven't gotten COVID yet, you probably will get Omicron at some point. That's what I haven't caught it yet. And my eldest son got it, and he was after being vaccinated, and you were vaccinated, correct? Right. Yeah. So it would have been a lot worse, most likely, had you not been vaccinated. And, going with the data there, we're pro-vaccine, and that can reduce some of the suffering, but even then people are catching some are, unfortunately, some suffer quite a bit, hospitalized, ICU, many have died. And so another truth in life is some people have a lot more suffering than others, and not to their own fault. I mean, sometimes, they say, shit happens. Right. Sometimes you're just unlucky in life. I think most of us are lucky to be born in this modern era, because, as we were talking about, although there's still a lot of suffering today, if we were looking objectively, there used to be more. For instance, like child and infant mortality rates have gone way, way down, up to about the last 100, 200 years. The infant and child mortality rates have been going way down. But historically, almost a third of kids did not see their first birthday for their first baby. They didn't even get to be a year old. And almost 50%, I think it's about 45%. And this is you can find it on ourworldindata.org, has lots of charts and stats on this, but about 45% of kids did not live to see the age of 15. And you can only imagine the worst thing probably ever is for a parent to lose a child. Like, the amount of suffering that causes is unimaginable. And my heart goes out to anyone who's endured a loss like that, or death of a loved one. It's just horrible. And even though that still exists today and people still suffer for it, there used to be a lot more of it. Just objectively, the sheer numbers were way higher of famines, plagues, wars, homicide. Medieval Europe had about 45 times the homicide rate back then than we do now in Western Europe. And another one is poverty, that 200 years ago, about 90 to 95% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty, and now less than 9% does. So again, trying to have a perspective of things. Now, that with this suffering, one of the things and we've talked about, Patrick, about Buddhism, and I'm not a Buddhist, but there's a lot I like about Buddhism, and Buddhist psychology is a huge thing in psychology these days, folks. If you haven't run into that, you might have heard a lot about mindfulness or read about it. And that's kind of the big thing now in psychology, is mindfulness, which is being in the present moment, non-judgmentally, and kind of accepting moment to moment, being present in the here and now, which gets us out of our head, which is the source of a lot of our suffering, which you will get to. But mindfulness comes from an Eastern tradition, although it is in pretty much every religion, or spiritual practice of, whether it's Hinduism or Christianity or Judaism, Islam, it's in pretty much every spiritual tradition. But Buddhism is really known for meditating and mindfulness. And so Western psychology is borrowing a lot from that. And people are going, wait a second, this is really good stuff. And Buddhism one of the reasons that they focus on mindfulness is that's a way out of the suffering. And Buddhism at its heart is a discipline or practice for dealing with suffering. And again, I'm not a Buddhist, and people know way more than me, and I'm sort of going off the top of my head about what I know here. But it's founded by Siddhartha, I think. Hey, Patrick, do a quick Google search to see if I got that right. I think it's Siddhartha. I think Keanu Reeves started a movie and played Siddhartha. You could look that up too, but anyway, I digress. Sorry, listener. But about 2,500 years ago in India, and the story goes, he was brought up to wealth and privilege and sheltered, and he didn't really see suffering because his parents didn't want him to. And I think he like snuck out or something, and he saw like, people dying and suffering in the streets, and was very concerned, like, oh my gosh, there's so much suffering in the world. What do we do about it? And, long story short, he ended up under the Bodhi tree. He became enlightened in how to deal with suffering. And the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, and people might have heard of this, but the first noble truth is life is suffering. Mm-hmm. And then kind of the rest is the practice of like, the suffering comes from desires and attachments, and there's ways out of suffering through practice. And again, I'm not Buddhist, and they have a 8-fold path, I think, of how to deal with the suffering. But the foundation of Buddhism is life is suffering, which I was like, man, that's depressing. Why isn't it life is beautiful? Like, why did they start with? But I think part is a bleak
way to start a whole religion.
It is a bleak way to start your religion. If I were starting a religion, I think I would start it with, life is good and we'll make it better. I don't know. Something like that. I don't know. But that life is suffering because there was much more suffering back then, objectively. And no matter how happy you are, there will be suffering in your life. So we still have the problem to deal with suffering, no matter who you are or where you go, how rich you are. Loved ones die, you get sick and ill, you're faced with disappointment, criticism, on and on and on, all these different forms of suffering. Mm-hmm. So no matter who you are, where you come from, we have to figure out how to deal with suffering.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think there's a lot of, from what I've read, at least, a lot of research on, different forms of psychopathology, like, depression and trauma, that shows that there's no one experience that causes people to experience depression, or
right.
There's no one experience that, qualifies as trauma. It's all relative to the person at hand. And we all have different levels of vulnerability to different experiences that might cause, a depressive episode,
right?
Have you? But it doesn't really matter what the event is in itself. It's our reaction to it. And so it's always going to happen. We're always going to experience suffering,
right?
Regardless of the stimulus, if you will. So it's kind of a universal truth in that way, especially according to Buddhism.
Right, exactly. Was it Siddhartha? Did you
yeah, it's Siddhartha. Siddhartha Gautama?
Yeah. I can't pronounce his last name. We'll have to have a Google help us with that. But at any rate, you listeners out there, if I'm, fact checking me, I'm going to have all sorts of things wrong. But that goes back to the reasonably good. We're not going to get everything right, but it's more, can we get close enough to some of these truths or nuggets? Mm-hmm. And can you put them to use? So if we're splitting hairs over everything I say, like, nothing is absolutely true of anything I say, or, there are very few truths in life. Ben Franklin said, there's there's like no certainties but death and taxes or something
Mhm.
like that. He was talking about the Constitution, but in life there's very few certainties. So when we're talking about, and you were saying this, Patrick, and you're right on about like depression, anxiety, very, very, I mean, none of those, is there one precipitating event,
Right.
that make you can put your finger on. Genetics play, I don't know, somewhere around 50% of our happiness or unhappiness. We have genetic predispositions, and then we encounter certain things in life, events. But then, as you were saying, Patrick, it's how do we interpret these events? How do we respond or react to them? That they can lead us down some darker roads or help us out of them. And that is really about what this is about, is dealing with suffering. So when you encounter these things, what do we do with these things so that we don't go down in a negative spiral and go down the drain? Because we will encounter suffering, and how we deal with these can take us down or help us, get through them. Now, that doesn't mean we won't suffer. We can suffer less and kind of make our way through the suffering. Versus, I don't know, if someone had a bad breakup, they could drink themselves into oblivion, every night and try to drown their sorrows. But ultimately, they're going to become an alcoholic. They're going to be dealing with hangovers. They're going to be missing jobs. They're not going to be doing well in school, or, they're not getting out and meeting new people. They're just drinking themselves silly. So now the precipitating event of a breakup, yes, painful. No matter if you had anyone out there, probably any you listening have had some type of breakup before, very painful. And, probably the longer and deeper the relationship, the more painful it is. But then how we deal with that, we can start to work toward healing and sometimes even growth from, bad things. The lotus grows from the muck. Or we could deal with it in maladaptive ways and think about, oh, I'm a loser. No one's going to love me again. I blew it. I'm just might as well just keep drinking, because what's the use, and then we get down that negative spiral. And then here's the other is some people have a genetic predisposition where it pulls them toward the negative path. So some people have to fight really hard to kind of work themselves out of it. And some it comes, have you met those people, Patrick, and you might be one of those, but I don't know, where you like something bad happens and it's like, and I can think of a few of the people like that, where something bad happens and they're like, yeah, I'm really bummed out, but it'll be okay. Give me a week or something. I'll be back. It's okay.
Yeah.
I'll learn from this. It's, yeah, it sucks, but I'll get through it. It's okay.
For the longest time, I was not that person. For the longest time, I didn't really understand this idea that we can actually interpret events in a different way. To an extent, there is, like you said, a genetic component to it, but we do have a say in how we react to things. Different adversities and challenges. It can be wind at your face, pushing you backwards, or it can be wind at your back, pushing you forward. So I used to not be that person at all, but ever since I started studying psychology, and familiarizing myself with things like Buddhist psychology, I realized that we do have a bit of a say in how we can react to things.
Yes. And so I'd offer to you listeners out there that Patrick and I are both kind of living proof that you can develop tools and skills to better deal with the adversities of life. We'll still suffer, but maybe not as deep and not as long, because we have things that we're doing. I'm much better at it now than I was when I was young. Things would really knock me for a loop when I was young, and still some things do, but it's about progress, not perfection, right? That's the thing, is what we're all about. It's like, can we make progress? Can we be a little bit better than we were the day before. And that's what I'm aiming to do. And, what things can I learn that can help me on this life journey, which I don't know, that to me, that's what it's about. How do we learn and grow and improve? And that's part of the whole meaning of life. And that was another episode, but I really believe that. So with the suffering that we're all going to encounter, it's a problem, a challenge for all of us to figure out how to deal with suffering in skillful ways. And first, suffering, it does have a function. It has a purpose. And I'd say it's rooted in our evolution. The part of when we're really hungry, and, that can cause suffering, hunger, right? Or thirst. Well, it motivates us to eat or drink. Or if we eat something healthy, like a healthy apple, our evolutionary ancestors, a sweet fruit, it would give us some pleasure. Boy, this is good. Well, it gives us pleasure in that moment, and it needs to, because that reinforces, hey, eat apples, they're good for you. Or if you ate something that made you sick, the suffering is to be avoided. It's like, no, the suffering is the signal, don't eat that. That's bad for you. In relationships, friendships, healthy relationships, one of the best things we can do to be happy in life is to have healthy relationships. So when we spend quality time, we just got through the holidays, and hopefully you got to spend some quality time with family and friends, Patrick. Yeah, you did.
Actually, I had the friend that gave me COVID. Actually, he was over with my family for the first time, so that was a nice experience to have.
It was good until it wasn't. Yeah, but that is what life's all about. It is spending that quality time with the friends and family. I had lots of good time. I love the holidays, to spend that with family and friends. Some people suffer more in the holidays because of loneliness. They don't have the relationship or as many, or maybe they got a divorce recently and the kids are bouncing between households and it's causing a lot of friction. So healthy relationships make us happy because those are good for us, because evolutionarily healthy relationships meant survival. We needed to be bonded to people to survive. We need each other to survive. And rejection, bullying, those sorts of things, harassment, they're painful because those are bad for us. They, when we're not in good relationship, that can historically, being cast out of the tribe could mean our death. So it's good that it's painful, because otherwise we wouldn't care if people didn't like us or rejected us, and that could lead to our death. So those are painful for a reason. So that's the part where, for our very existence, the pain of certain pains, of certain types of suffering are necessary. And I was calling those level one suffering. Mm-hmm. So we got level one suffering is this pain is inevitable. I would call that the level one type of suffering that we cannot avoid. The level two suffering is this second level. The suffering is optional. Pain is inevitable. Level one suffering is optional. So this type of suffering is the one we can do more about. It's related to the first one, but it's something we can do a lot more about. Level two suffering, I'm calling it. And because I'm trying to do a reasonably good podcast and with you here, I think that would be a good stopping point, because this other one's going to be an important and a meaty conversation about level two suffering. So what we're doing today is covering the purpose of suffering, why we suffer, and then how it's a problem for us. It's a challenge in our lives that we need to deal with. But here's the thing, is that level two suffering is often more pervasive and it's more insidious. And probably in our Western world, where we're not dying of starvation and things like that every day, we are taking care of some of these basic needs fairly well in modern society, especially here in America and in many parts of the world. This level 2 suffering is the one that we have to deal with more of. And Buddhists have worked on that for thousands of years, but Western psychology is borrowing a lot from that to deal with it day to day. And that's what I want to cover more of next one. And maybe we'll do, I don't know if we're going to do weekly or every other week. Patrick, do you know?
I think we'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. Yeah. And it has been a little while since the last one. And the reason why, because we're trying to figure out what's the best format to do this, but we're trying this focusing more on the podcast than the YouTube and to see how this goes. But, I've enjoyed it. And hopefully listeners, you are getting something out of this and will join us for the next episode where we're going to dig in to that level 2 suffering and then work at like how to deal with it, because that's where a lot of our day-to-day suffering comes from. And it's something we can do more about. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. This has been Dr. Mike Brooks along with Patrick Kennedy for the Reasonably Good Life podcast. Be curious, be flexible, be kind, and for goodness sakes, be reasonable. And we hope to have you back next week. Thanks a lot.